Welcome to Self-Esteem Matters, an ethics-based webinar for women, sponsored by CPE Think. I'd like to thank Jennifer Sullivan for her contribution in developing the curriculum. We work together on this, and often she will co-facilitate with me. However, she's on maternity leave, so that won't happen for this particular program. I also want to mention that although the title says that this is an ethics-based webinar for women, the issues and the content of this program are relevant for anyone, regardless of how they identify. We chose issues that impact people not only in professional life, but in their personal lives as well. So I want to start with a story. And I heard this a long time ago. I don't know if it's true or not. It very well could be true. Susan works in a huge, busy city, and she's a people watcher. So every day she'd go out to lunch, and she would just observe. There were so many different kinds of people, and she just loved doing that. On this particular day, Susan went back to the office and said to her colleague, Cindy, "You won't believe it. I saw my twin. I saw someone who looked exactly like me. She was my height, she had my features, she had my coloring, she even wore jewelry that I would pick out." And her colleague said, "Well, did you talk to her? Did you find out anything? Where she lives, where she's from?" And Susan said, "Nah, I just didn't like her vibe." Which leads us to our agenda. So today we're going to talk about ethics and self-esteem, and we're going to weave the two together because they're very much related. Virtue ethics, we'll talk about what that means, give an overview of Aristotle's ethics. We'll talk about self-esteem, and that's a huge topic. What is it? Why do we care? And what are the traps if we have low self-esteem? And what are some of the ways we might minimize those traps? And as I mentioned before, we're going to weave in ethical values as we go through the program. So our objectives for today, as I mentioned, to look at the relationship between ethics and self-esteem, to understand the impact our level of self-esteem has on our well-being, and this is highly researched and documented. To think about the fact that we have choices and we can let go of some unhealthy beliefs that don't serve us well, that we came to believe based on our background. We'll talk about the benefits of high self-esteem, which show up in every area of our lives. As I mentioned before, we're going to look at traps of low self-esteem and some suggestions for not falling into them. We'll talk about the components of high self-esteem and ways that we can enhance our feelings towards self. And one of my objectives is to have you leave here, your computer, and feel like your time was well spent. So what is virtue ethics and why does it matter? I am an ethics educator. Often they jump to regulatory compliance, which is important, obviously. That, however, is not how I teach ethics. I teach it through a values-based lens. And ultimately, it's about our relationship to self, others, and the world in which we live. And inherent in that are decisions we make, actions, and impact. It requires a great deal of mindfulness, and I work on that, and trust me, I have a ways to go. Let me give you an example. This was a while ago, maybe 4 years ago. I would go to the rec center to use the hot tub. And on this particular day, there were 3 elderly women in the hot tub, seeming to enjoy themselves. Now, when I say elderly, I'm nearly 74. I would say they were at least a decade older. And without thinking, I put on the jets. They had been off, and they jumped. Now, I could have done some real damage. I didn't give them any warning. I didn't ask them. It was a surprise to them, and it frightened them. That's an example that my impact was not favorable because I wasn't mindful. Aristotle is one of the founders of ethics, and we'll go into some of his beliefs in just a moment. I do want to have a caveat. As with anything I study, I take what resonates and I discard the rest. In Aristotle's case, there's so much that he says that aligns with my values, but not everything. He, as I understand it, believed women were inferior, intellectually inferior to men, and that their place was in the home. Clearly, I don't agree with that, or we wouldn't be having this workshop. So, Aristotle, a Greek philosopher, is one of the founders of ethics. And what he says is that we have two types of virtue. One is intellectual, and all of us have that because of life experience, on-the-job training, education. We all have intellectual virtue. On the other hand, there is moral virtue, and that's about character development, and that we are not born with. So how do we achieve moral virtue? Purposeful habit. So for instance, if I want to be more generous, I act more generous and I become what I am acting as. So you've heard people say, oh, that's just like them. That's just like her. They're talking about our habits. So if we have an intention to grow a virtue, and virtue is excellence of character, then we do it with intention and in purposeful habit. Why care? Happiness, as I understand Aristotle's definition, is being the best we can. Being the best we can. And why? For the common good. Now, the common good means a lot of different things to people these days. I suspect it had a different meaning in more ancient times. As I just said, the common good means different things to different people. And in Aristotle's day, we didn't have as many pluralistic communities. Our world has so many different sections and factions. I believe it would be quite different today to reach the common good, though I would hope we would try, than in Aristotle's day. But I'm not much of a historian, so I don't really know the ins and outs of their daily life. Let me read the definition of common good. The common good is a notion that originated over 2,000 years ago in the writings of Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero. More recently, the ethicist John Rawls defined the common good as certain general conditions that are equally to everyone's advantage as an important ethical concept in a society. So here we're talking about access. Everyone should have access to health, to education, to safety. It's inclusive. And that concept is reawakening with an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the work. Another definition, certain general conditions that are equally to everyone's advantage. So again, a lot of obstacles to overcome, and we can be the best we can be. So let's move on by asking, so why does our level of self-esteem matter, and how is it related to ethics? So you may remember that when we covered virtue ethics, I defined ethics in part as our relationship to self, others, and the world in which we live. So too, level of self-esteem impacts relationship to self, others, and the world in which we live. Therefore, the higher we regard ourselves, the better we feel about ourselves, the more our heart is open to treat others in virtuous ways. It connects us. Brené Brown says, connection is the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued. Another word, I think, for that is love. So what is self-esteem? Self-esteem is the reputation you have with yourself. Author unknown. Self-esteem is fluid. It can be high at times, it can be low at times, it can be in the middle, it's situational. It's also influenced by experiences and interactions and beliefs. It is not set in stone. We can, as adults, take on the charge of letting go of the things that don't work for us, that make us feel less than. And knowing we have choice, it is also not something we're born with. The midwife, the doctor, the nurse does not say to a new mother, congratulations, you have a girl, she's 6 pounds, 8 ounces, and she's so confident. She just is so confident she'll do well in this life. So because our level of self-esteem is so important, let's look at some of the components of high self-esteem. So here are some components of self-esteem, of high self-esteem. And what we're going to do is go over them individually. So self-awareness, there is no finish line, so to speak, in terms of self-awareness. It is a process. Who are we? What do we care about? What are our values? What are our strengths? How did we get here? How did I become who I am? What or how do I want to be treated? How do others feel after they've been with me in my company? What are my biases? What are my blind spots? There's just so much to know. So self-awareness has a lot of components, and we're going to go over these individually, starting with know our strengths. All too often, we focus on what we don't do well or the mistakes we've made. A component of high self-esteem is knowing our strengths, and there are ways we can do that. We can certainly pay attention to genuine compliments and feedback. We can pay attention to what we enjoy doing, because often there's a correlation. If we enjoy something, we're typically good at it. We can ask input from friends and colleagues. You've known me for 15 years. What do you consider some of my strengths? Don't ask people who you owe money to. We can do online assessments. We can think of the needs or problems the world has and how we might meet them. There's many different ways to identify strengths, and in just a few minutes we're going to go over a specific technique. So let's talk about identifying accomplishments and victories, which, as I mentioned before, are so overlooked much of the time.